Welcome to this presentation. I'm Don Corleon, and today we're going to talk about why the solver mixes. Specifically, I'm going to talk about equity realization and just trying to take slightly more optimal EV lines. Today, we're going to be covering how to play every hand in the most profitable way. Strong statement. I feel like a lot of people kind of give up on using their brain or making a slightly better decision based on RNG, based on the solver says it's different. I'm going to talk about why maybe, even outside of exploitative reasons, just based on human nature, human limitations, outside of what your opponents might do or might not do to exploit you or to deviate from equilibrium, there might be some lines that are slightly better than others with certain hands, or at least you could split your range in a way that's slightly different than how the solver does it. We're going to try to understand strategies and see the order in chaos. So when you open a sim, especially if you're kind of new to solvers, you open a sim and it's like, what the hell am I even looking at? Right? Like it's just a chart with every hand is mixing and folding, calling, raising at 3%. Like, do I RNG at 17% or 14? Or why is this hand raising but this is not? And like it's just a mess, right? There's a level of I would say simplification, but not in the usual way that people use it, not in the range bet or pick one sizing on the, I'm not talking about that kind of simplification, but more so conceptual simplification, understanding the main concepts and then visualizing the ranges in a more broad terms allows you to look at a chart in the solver and be like, okay, I get everything. There's like these little details, like the small frequency or whatever, but I get the big picture. Play based on logic, not chance. It is pretty bad to leave a decision to a mix whenever you could find a better way. Arguably, there are times where you can't find anything, right? There are times where maybe you get to the conclusion that there's actually no way for me to figure out if it's better to call, fold, or whatever. But there's a lot of times, the vast majority of the time, there will be either a clear exploitative reason, either your opponents have a leak, or pick a certain blocker to do something and a certain other blocker to do something else. So we're going to try to understand the real game of poker as opposed to its computer abstractions. So what's the point of mixing? Well, the reason the solver mixes is because if your opponent is, or if your range is face up, your opponent is going to take advantage of it, right? If you don't have flush crossing your check back range on the flop, then when the flush comes, you never have a flush. Your opponent can overbet and then shove, right? If you always bet with backdoor flush draws and never without a backdoor flush draw, and whenever the backdoor flush draw hits in the bet line, that you have just way too many flushes, right? There's just all these little details that come from having a quote unquote face up range. And face up could mean just too many second pairs or not enough nuts or not all these sorts of things. It also prevents morphology irregularities, right? This is a bit more of a complex reason. For example, let's give an easy example. If you're on the flop, let's say, and you were to say, okay, I'm going to c-bet air when I have a 4 in my hand, right? When I have air with a 4 in it, I'm going to c-bet. You might be overall balanced, like broadly speaking balanced, like your fold to a flop raise is going to be in line, your fold to a turn probe is going to be in line, your amount of bluffs is going to be more or less balanced, right? But there are some morphology irregularities in the sense that if the turn comes a 4, you're going to have a 4 overwhelmingly majority of the time, right? If you check back and there's a 4, now you don't have 4x, right? All these little things that the solver is really good at exploiting. Now, a human is very, very, very bad at exploiting those things. And that's not even to dismiss the human and to say he plays bad. It's just not possible, right? When I exploit you, what I do is I look at a HUD. I open the HUD and I look at the HUD. I look at your showdowns and I see what you're showing down with. I look at what notes I've taken on you and I read them, right? I look at the information that I've gathered and then I try to build a counter strategy against you. But these are things that are basically uncounterable even by the best players, right? So this one is a little bit more iffy in practice. it also allows you to balance everywhere to absolute precision. So there will be some spots, for example, if you're on the river, right? And your range contains, let's say, 4 combos of value and 2 combos of bluffs, right? That's your range. It has 4 combos of value, or let's just say it has 4 combos of value and 4 combos of bluffs, just 4 and 4. And the SPR is 1.17, right? Like a strange, like a not 1-to-1, right? SPR is 1.17. Well, your value to bluff ratio is not going to be able to be, you're not going to be able to reach that value to bluff ratio if you just pure bet or check hands, right? So theoretically there, you would need to RNG in order to reach the proper ratio, right? If it's 2 value per 1.13 bluff, then you would have to figure out how to do that, right? Again, this one is a little bit more easy because how often have you made a call or a fold on river because you thought that your opponent had a 2-to-1 ratio instead of a 2-to-1.13 ratio? Like, that level of precision is not even possible. So let's talk about this example. This is going to be single raise pot, bottom versus big blind, queen 8-2 two-tone, and we're going to be looking at differences between CFR and AI solvers. And the reason is because the CFR solver is actually calculating everything that's going to happen throughout the hand on every single situation, right? The CFR is almost like a brute force, truer version of like total math, just doing math for every single possible situation that could happen. Whereas the AI works a little bit more like a human, obviously much better, but it estimates what's going to happen in the future, roughly, and then it gets very precise on the present, right? So on the current node, on an AI solver, on the flop, it's going to be very, very, very precise when calculating things that happen on the flop. And then whenever it looks into the future, what's going to happen on the turn on the river, it's just kind of like estimated, guessing a little bit what's going to happen. That's a lot more how the game is actually kind of played in practice. So let's try to understand those differences. So what we can see is there's obviously a lot of mixing involved. There's a lot of sizings. There's a lot of stuff. And the general sizing is big. And the general frequency is, let's say, mid-frequency. Okay. Now let's go, for example, to the air, which is going to be very, very, my point is going to come across very, very easily when we look at air, right? Got ace high and worse. And let's actually go to no draw. So this is not even backdoor flush draw, right? And we see that basically, there's some ace X here that's basically pure checking, right? Basically pure checking because it's just, the kind of hand that has enough value to win at showdown sometimes, but not enough value to actually get called by worse a significant amount of the time. When you get to ace 4 and lower, or ace 5 and lower, you see that it's basically like most hands are betting at a similar frequency, right? There's some that are betting more, like king 3 and whatever, but all of them are betting at a decent frequency, right? Even has like 9-6 of clubs, which seems like it's nothing, right? Or 5-4 of clubs, 5-4 of diamonds. It's almost like it doesn't matter, right? Like, why? Like, how come it's how is it possible that betting with king 4, which has an overcard, is just as valid as betting with 5-4? Seems a bit counterintuitive, right? And well, in this particular example, 5-4 and king 4, they have different reasons why they bet, but they both have valid reasons. But that's a valid question. Like, it's not possible that all hands are equally valid for betting or checking, right? There must be a reason why one would be better than the other, and there is. So when we look at, for example, the AI solver, which, as I said, it actually is not preventing very, 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 very detailed exploits on very future nodes. So on it's not preventing things that is going to happen on the turn and the river. We see that we go to the air portion, no draw, and there's not as much mixing, right? We see that these hands are checking, these hands are betting a lot, and then these hands are betting a lot, and then this and this, right? It's a very clear-cut distinction. Right? Let's try to explain that distinction. The overall frequency of the air with no backdoor flush draw is going to be somewhat similar, right? Somewhat similar. But here it's saying we're betting 6-5, 6-4, these sorts of things, and we're betting king jack, king 10, king 9. Okay, so why? There's a couple reasons why betting, for example, king jack, king 10, king 9 is better than betting complete air, right? King X has an overcard. And then specifically king jack, king 10, king 9, they have backdoor straight draws, right? Not only backdoor straight draws, but the fact that you have a jack itself is going to block your opponent from having, for example, jack 10, which is continue. So these hands are, pretty reasonable in that sense. Then these hands down here, it's for a completely different reason. I would say it's more to do with unblockers. It's more to do with folding out hands that have us dominated. For example, if you have 6-5 and you bet, you can fold out jack 6, 10-6, 9-6, right? You fold out hands that dominate you. And also you kind of unblock a lot of the ball crap that exists in your opponent range. Which one is the true strategy? How come the AI is doing this and the CFR is doing the other thing? Does the CFR not know those things? Does the CFR not know that certain blockers are better than others? It does, but what happens is that in the future, on the turn and the river, the opponent solver is so good that, for example, again, if you bet too much with a 6 in your hand, and it's going to know that on a 6, you're not going to hit certain third pairs on a certain run out, and it's going to be able to use a certain bet size with bluffs to attack your inelasticity, right? It's just such a detailed level of exploit and accuracy that it's trying to prevent that is just not realistic. Not even in the toughest games, right? It's just not things that any player really thinks about too much, because it's just so detailed that you're just missing the forest for the trees, right? You can see having unblockers, having extra equity, the back straight draw, having being able to fold out hands that have us dominated. So when you have very low cards, you can fold out air that has higher cards than you. And then, if we go to backdoor flush draws, then suddenly we're going to see a lot more betting, right? Extra equity and whatnot, backdoor straight draws as well. And when we go to top pairs, for example, that's also an interesting hand class to look at. We're also going to see that if we go back to the CFR, it would all be mixed up. All of the top pairs would be betting and checking at some frequency, right? It would be tapering down, it would be betting less with the weaker top pairs, but overall, it would just bet with everything and check with everything, right? While the AI is always saying, no, okay, I'm going to bet with top pairs with the backdoor flush draw because these are the ones that I'm going to be able to get more value when a heart comes, right? When a heart comes on the turn, I'm going to be able to bet again on the turn. And if another heart comes on the river, I'm going to be able to go for 3 streets, right? Which is not something that you can do with a lot of top pairs. And then also for the ones that are checking, again, if we looked at the CFR solver, we'd see that these would all be betting and checking at some frequency, right? A very similar frequency, almost equal. While the AI solver is saying, no, I'm going to check when I have the ace of spades because I'm blocking my opponent from having a6 of spades or certain, first of all, it has more protection, right? You don't need to bet as much for protection when you have the ace of spades, and also blocks worse calls. It's saying, no, I'm not going to mix everything. I'm just going to pick certain blockers that unblock, for example, here, the queen of hearts. And the ones that are betting the most are queen 9 in this case, without anything to do with the board in terms of suits, right? Because those need the most protection and they unblock the most worse calls, okay? So which one is true? Is the RNG everything true, or this one is true? Well, the RNG everything is more theoretically correct, so to speak. Like, it's more mathematically accurate, but in practice, it's not necessarily, right? Because the reason why the CFR solver is mixing all of these ace queens is because if you only did with the ace of spades, your opponent would know. If it has the ace of spades, you would never have a ace queen on the check back line, right? It's just a very specific, very, very, very specific reason. Not super realistic. The real game. The EV from small hand characteristics is more important than the EV from future extremely clairvoyant responses, right? The original CFR solver is trying to protect against extremely clairvoyant responses by mixing everything up, by giving up on a little bit of that hand characteristic, just straight up logical source of EV. Board coverage matters in a broad sense, right? So there are things that humans can exploit. For example, if you don't check back flush draws, this is something that a human can easily exploit. This is very obvious and intuitive. If I know that you don't check back flush draws, then I'm able to bet more when a flush hits and you check back, or to fold more when a flush hits after you bet, right? But I don't exactly know if the flush draws that you check back contain an 8 too much, and therefore when the 8 of hearts comes on the turn, you never have a flush. That's not something I can know. So there's a limit to where board coverage matters. It matters, but there's a limit. And blocker irregularities matter a lot less. This is basically what I'm saying. Board coverage matters in a broad sense, but it doesn't matter if whenever you hit a second pair, it always has a king kicker. That's not something that your opponents are ever going to be able to exploit, right? Oh, whenever I check back and the 10 comes and I do hit a 10, it's always with the king kicker. Yeah, I mean, your opponents now could bluff you when they have a king in hand and then check call you always when they have a king. It's just not very realistic. So let's talk about hand characteristics and how to try to build ranges that are attempting to have similar frequencies than the solver, if that's what you're striving for in a certain node, but splitting your hands in a way, rakes in a little bit more EV. So with value, what you want is to unblock calls. What you want is, especially when your value is weaker, you want to have extra equity. When your value is very, very strong, you don't really care so much about having extra equity. But when your value is thinner, having extra equity is very valuable. It allows you to potentially go for multiple streets in some cases. Whereas if you have a really, really, really strong hand, you will go for multiple streets anyway. Falling on hands with equity, right? If, for example, a low board comes and you're going to check back some overpairs, the one that is most obvious to check back is aces, right? Because aces doesn't fold out hands with equity against it. You bet with aces, you just fold out undercards. So like a 6-5-3 board, well, a hand like eights folds out a lot of overcards, where aces doesn't. And getting called by dominated hands. If you have a value hand, but whenever you bet, you get called by hands that are drawing pretty well against you, that's not as interesting as betting with a hand that when you get called, they're just crushed. Right? Like, for example, this is common in when you look at a solver a lot, you'll see that on flop, top and bottom, 2 pair. Right? So on a queen A deuce, queen deuce, see that that's usually a hand that tends to play more passively. Right? And it's because your opponent's queen X are actually drawing pretty well against you. Right? If the board pairs in some way, you could get counterfeited very easily. And that's not that good when you have when you build a big pot with that sort of hand. So whenever your opponents are drawing pretty well against you, it's not as interesting to bet. Whenever those hands that draw call, right? If you can make those hands that draw fold, again, that becomes a great reason to bet. With bluffs, having robust equity, meaning drawing to something good. If the board is very dry, maybe having an overcard is robust, because whenever you do hit the top pair, it's going to be a very, very strong hand. But on a very, 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 very wet board, maybe having an overcard is not really that robust, because when you do hit your top pair, it's not that good. Obviously, robust equity comes from flush draws as well, straight draws, backdoor flush draws, backdoor straight draws, anything that's drawing, even if it's a very small chance, whenever a small chance is to hit something big, that's robust equity, no matter how small chance it is. Not having non-robust equity, that's a good reason to bet. And non-robust equity would be the one that is basically hitting a second pair, right? This is why you see, for example, on a board like ace, 7, deuce, hands like king, queen, queen, jack, not only they have some showdown, but also they have a lot of non-robust equity. They have a lot of equity that comes from hitting a second pair. And when you hit a second pair, you don't want to grow the pot a lot. So having future prospects of hitting a middling hand is an incentive to keep the pot small preemptively. Unblocking folds. So you will see very often that having, for example, an overcard and then a very low card that doesn't really affect your opponent's range, that's pretty good as well for bluffing. This is just the second, the kicker in this case is unblocking a lot of the folds. And then domination effects. So we talked about how 6-5, 5-4 were betting a lot before because they can fold knight 6, 10 6, jack 6, right? Whereas when you do have jack 6, maybe it's not as interesting to fold because you will fold out 10 6, 9 6, right? So it works both ways. Let's talk about a hand's worth. This is a very, very, very important concept. I would say that from probably 500 NL online downwards, and live, I would imagine almost at no point, people really don't really apply this concept. Essentially, don't understand this idea. You could simplify conceptually how a solver works by imagining that each value hand is worth a certain amount of big blinds, right? Of course, the solver is actually not conceptualizing it. It's just doing math and calculations, but the strategies it arrives at happen to align with this idea that each hand has a certain big blind worth. And every line that the solver plays is trying to be conducive to that amount of pot growth. For example, if you have a hand that is worth, let's say the pot is 6 big blinds, right? And you're out of position on the river and your hand is worth 2 big blinds. The only way to be conducive to that amount of pot growth is to bet 2 big blinds yourself. If you check, it's not conducive. Your opponent is either going to check back or bet big, usually, the majority of the time. Right? They're going to bet 4 or 5 big blinds, or they're going to check. And so it's not conducive. So betting small in that case, this is why a lot of the time, when you have a hand that is worth a small bet on the river out of position, very often that's a must play, so to speak. That's a play that you kind of just have to do, unless you have a very clear exploit or you're just doing something outside of solver reasons. But in terms of how the solver thinks, those hands very often bet extremely often, if not always. So you should always only take lines that are conducive to that amount of pot growth. And this is true even on earlier streets. If you're polarizing the turn, you have to think, what am I going to do on the river, right? Am I playing my hand in a way on the turn that is going to be conducive to the amount that this hand is worth by showdown? Or am I getting into a line where I'm never going to get what I want? We'll see how that is reflected. Let's try this quiz. So the line is the same board as before, but it goes check down to the river. Okay, so queen a deuce two-tone, check a 3, check a 2. Okay, and the question, I didn't write it out because it was too long of a question. Question is, what is the main line we take when we have queen nine? Okay, specifically queen nine. We pull up the vote. So specifically with queen nine, what is the main line we would take after this bomb versus big blind? Check, check, flop. Check, check, turn. We're out of position, by the way. We're out of position. What is the main line the hand would take? And the answer is 300% pot. I mean, think about it. If you were on the turn, right, you've checked the turn. Would you think that, for example, betting 2/3 and then betting 2/3 on river, let's, the turn is an overbet only spot, right? So let's, of course, if we're trying to play balance, we wouldn't bet 2/3. But let's say we did, right? Do you think we would get to a proper amount of pot growth if we bet 2/3 on turn and then 2/3 on river? I would say yes, right? That would be a reasonable amount of pot growth for a hand like queen nine. Or, for example, if you checked, your opponent bet 2/3 on the turn, and then he bets 2/3 on the river, would you call happily? Yeah, I mean, you're just getting basically to the size of the pot that queen nine wants, right? And those two bets are going to grow the pot not by 150, right? Because the second bet is being made on a very big pot at that point, right? The first bet is 2/3, but the second 2/3 bet is being made on a bigger pot. So it amounts to around 3 times the pot growth. Let's look at it. And we see that queen nine is pretty much betting only 3 times the pot. Just think about it. If on the turn queen nine is worth 2 streets, on the river it can't just be worth 1 street all of a sudden on a pretty bricky runout. And now if the runout came flush or a straight completed or something like that, I mean, the 2 gives trips, but not that many, right? So on a pretty bricky runout, if on the turn queen nine is worth 2 streets, it can't suddenly be that on the river on a break is worth 1. So betting 150 is just too small. It's just not quite worth as much as 2 streets. This is why hands like queen jack, queen 10, queen 9, they are worth around 16 big blinds. And on the turn, if, for example, the turn was different, because on this turn it's only over bet or check. Let's imagine, for example, that the turn is a 10 and that our strategy is actually a 2/3 strategy. Hands like queen jack, for example, would be able to bet for 2/3 because it's going to bet on the river again. It's not betting just because, oh, my hand is just, I'm going to bet 2/3. Because on the river, I want to grow the pot to that amount of pot growth that my hand is worth. Boxing Beach says, I thought it would bet 33% to strengthen the 33% betting range to not just have underpaired hands. I see that the solver is also betting some 32% with some trips on the river for balance. Well, I mean, those kinds of lines are usually not taken at a super high frequency. I mean, they do happen, right? And by the way, if you think about it, 33%, if your hand is worth about 3 times the current pot in terms of big blind worth, right? If queen 9 was worth 16 big blinds in that pot that we looked at before, betting small is not very conducive to that. Because if you get called, the pot is smaller. And if you get raised, usually the pot is smaller as well, right? If you bet 1/3 and your opponent raises, the opponent is going to raise maybe to 8, 9 big blinds commonly, right? And let's say the pot is 5.5, you bet 1.5 or 2 big blinds. A raise is going to be around 7, 8, 9 big blinds. So again, it's not conducive to the pot size that you want. It could be, for example, that you bet 2/3 and then you get raised. Now you're getting to a more appropriate pot size for queen 9 in that line. This is why, if I recall correctly, the main line was 3x, and then a small frequency of those hands were actually betting 2/3 or 3/4 or whatever, not the other sizings. So yeah, I mean, these hands, let's look at this turn, right? The hands that are betting for value here, it's not because the hand is worth 2/3. It's because you're going to value bet twice, right? You're trying to grow the pot to a certain amount that's going to be around, I don't know, 12 big blinds bigger than you know what I mean, right? So we're going to bet like 3.7, 4 big blinds now, and then we're going to add another 10 maybe on the river with another bet. So that's why we're betting these hands. Now, let's talk about hands like Queen 5, right? And Queen 4. Now, again, the solver is doing things that are very, very strange and that don't really apply, right? It's just trying to balance a big bet on turn to then block on river on a brick at a tiny frequency, like at 2%. Like, it's just not a very important line to have in your repertoire, in my opinion. But the main line with Queen 5, Queen 4, which is Queen without a kicker, that is going to play on the river. Your Queen 5, Queen 4 on the river is just the kicker's almost never going to play. These hands basically are worth about 150% of the pot, right? So if these hands are worth about 300% of the pot, like a Queen Jack, for example, Queen without a kicker, you could say it's worth about a normal overbet, right? And if you bet 2/3 now, it's not conducive. Once again, it's not conducive to getting that pot roll that you want when you have Queen 5, Queen 4, right? If you bet 2/3 now on river, you would have to bet like a block to get your appropriate amount of pot roll, and we will see that that's actually probably what happens if the river is a 6, maybe the 6 is a little bit too board changing. Maybe let's just do a complete brick. I don't know if this exact card will get the point across, but basically my point is that now you have hands like Queen 6, Queen 5 that are just generating a tiny block bet sizing that doesn't really do much. If you bet with Queen 5 on the turn, it's to bet small on the river on a break, right? That's the way to get to about a normal overbet amount of money in the pot. Again, your hand has a certain worth, and you're trying to take lines that are conducive, which in this case, the main line that is conducive is to check. Why does Queen 5 the most conducive line to the right amount of money is to check? Well, because you're gonna check, turn is gonna go check. If a break comes, you overbet, or you bet pot or something like that, right? That's how you get the exact money that this hand wants. If you start betting now, it's gonna get very iffy, right? You're gonna have to either face a bet on the river that's going to be too big for your hand, or you're going to have to do a wacky line to just like bet a certain sizing that is kind of imbalanced in order to do it, right? The solver can do it. The solver can mix these hands for a small frequency because that unintuitive block size on the river is going to be perfectly balanced. But the less of those things you do, the more balanced you're going to be able to be, right? If you have a lot of little sizing splits and intuitive hands that are low frequency, you're gonna have to, either accept that your hand is face up or go to extreme extents to try to balance it out. So the lines that are taken are trying to be conducive to the pot growth that the hand wants. And this is true on earlier streets and on later streets, especially when you're starting to polarize. When you're starting to polarize, you can be a lot more clear cut with saying like, okay, this hand, if I start polarizing with this hand now, the exact amount of big blinds that I want to shovel into the pot with this hand is just not going to be met if I start betting now. Whereas if I check, it is, right? Queen 5 check, break, overbet. Queen 5 bet, on a break, block. Now you have to care about another range to balance. Whereas a hand like Queen Jack, for example, just a very clear bet big on turn, bet big on river. Plain and simple. Right? And then some other hands are bet big to the overbet, and so on and so forth. Right? Each hand has its own rough big blind amount that it wants to invest in the pot, and there are only so many lines that you can take. The solver is going to come up with an infinite amount of lines that are able to get to that size of the pot, but the more practical you are about it, the better. Right? It should be like, okay, what are the actual reasonable, straightforward lines that get to this amount of money? It doesn't always have to be an aggressive line, right? As you can see, if this hand is worth about 150%, you can check it on the turn and then bet 150, right? It can be a more trappy line, or it can be even a trappy line on the river, right? If your hand is worth all the chips, if your hand is worth all in, you don't have to just lead all in necessarily. It could be conducive to that pot growth to check raise or to block 3-bet, the river, right? Promoting and being conducive to a certain pot growth doesn't mean betting yourself. It means creating situations, promoting situations in which the pot is going to end up at that size, whether it's you doing the betting or your opponent doing the betting or the raising. By the way, don't get too caught up with blockers. Okay? Blockers are the tiebreaker, right? Even in the solver, right? It's not just the tiebreaker for like human world. Like, oh, this is not over bluffed nor under bluffed, so I'm gonna tiebreaker with a blocker. Even in the solver, it's a tiebreaker. If Queen 9 is worth 3 times the pot, it's just worth 3 times the pot. No blocker is gonna change that. Right? It's just that. It's just worth that. So you can't sacrifice that for a blocker. Right now, the blocker could take it into different lines within that constraint, right? Okay, I need to get to a certain growth of the pot. My blockers could lean towards making me take one line or the other. For example, ace deuce. It makes a lot of sense that it would be the most checkable one, right? Ace deuce is really, really checkable because the ace is a really good blocker for checking. And then Queen 9, by the way, Queen 9, Queen 10, Queen Jack, the reason why they don't do much other than betting is because Jack, 10, and 9 block a lot of bluffs, right? So I think you're looking at it the wrong way, where you're thinking, oh, you're blocking calls. No, what you're actually blocking is bluffs. You have a Jack, a 10, or 9 in hand. You don't want to check or do something wacky because you're blocking a lot of bluffs. So you just kind of want to grow the pot yourself. The size of the pot, the growth of the pot doesn't end at 150 or 3x. It ends at whatever the hand is worth. If the hand is worth all the marbles, the lines you need to take are whatever arrives at an all-in. If the hand is worth 3x, then whatever arrives at a 3x. If the hand is worth about 150, and what we can see, so we don't really have a lot of hands that are worth 2/3, but here it would be second pair, right? An 8 here is worth around 2/3. And what we see is that it's checking a lot. It's betting 2/3 sometimes, but the majority of the time it's checking, right? But if you think about it, checking is a very conducive line to get to a 2/3 pot growth. Because if you check with an 8 and you face a bet, the majority of the time you're getting exactly to the size of the pot you want. Right? So checking, so it's very, very common that hands that can bet for 3/4 or 2/3 out of position are on the river are the very good candidates for checking. That's a very common thing. Whereas hands that are stronger, like worth an overbet, they're usually not as good for checking unless they're like back to really, 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 really strong, right? There's a certain bracket of hands that is like, okay, I'm not going to check because if I check now, I don't get to the size of the pot. For example, if you have Queen 7, checking would be totally wasting a hand, right? Because if you check raise, now the check raise is too big. And if you check call, now the pot is too small, right? So checking Queen 7 is not conducive at all to the pot roll that hand wants, right? So this is way more important than blockers. This is a very fundamental heuristic and how the game works. Each hand wants to grow the pot to a certain size, and you can plan it out on earlier streets. And my hand on a breaky run out is worth this amount. Okay, so I can start building the pot now, or I can do this, or I can do that. That's very important. And as I said, hands that are worth about a block, they just pure bet. Because checking this would never arrive at the pot size you want. If you check with 7s, your opponent is going to either check back or bet bigger. Not the right investment. So I hope I got my point across. Each hand has a certain worth. And if you look at almost any line on the same runout, let's say on a breaky runout, for example, you look at times where you call the flop, check, turn, bet river, or check, flop, check, turn, bet river. Like somehow it seems like everything conspires to you're trying to get to the same size of the pot. Let's talk about reasons to RNG. So far, we've talked about reasons why not to RNG, right? There's always concepts and heuristics that govern the game that simplify conceptually what you're looking at, that allow you to basically logically arrive at what the proper line is for your hand, right? Now, what are the reasons to RNG? The reason to RNG is basically very low frequency actions. This is very reasonable. For example, if you want to develop a raising range on the turn or something like that, these are usually very low frequency lines when it's like a 5%, 10% line. So it could make sense to RNG there, because if you pick just like good combos for raising, it's just going to be a million combos, right? So it could be reasonable there to do it for very low frequency actions. Also, when ranges are very, very narrow, think about like a called 4-bet pot where your range is like a ton of ace king, right? Maybe it could be argued that it would be reasonable on some flops and turns with your ace king to do some type of RNG, for example, as a band-aid temporary fix. Now, this is something I've done before. I don't RNG a lot, but I've really improved a lot at times by RNG. What I mean by this is there's times where I've had a big leak in my game. Let's say, for example, I don't know, folding a certain note, right? Sure. I mean, the best thing you can do is learn how exactly the blockers work, how exactly the line works, the thresholds, study MDA, study how people are deviating in one way or that, like build a very good sound strategy that tries to maximize ED with each hand. That's the best thing you can do. But in the meantime, sometimes just like saying, okay, I'm going to fix this overfolding. Whenever I get to this spot, I'm going to use the RNG, right? And then when you do that, you'll see that your stat gets better. Right? If it was really bad, you use RNG, your stat gets better. So it's a bit of a band-aid fix before you actually get and fix it for real, right? But you need to understand that it is a bit of a transition, right? Basically, the way I want you to think about it is, let's say you're facing a bet on the river and you decide, okay, I'm going to RNG. Because I don't know if this guy's overfolding here or over bluffing or under bluffing. I really, really, really don't know. So I'm just going to RNG. That's not horrible. It's not a bad protocol. But the way you need to think about it is realize that you've surrendered at that point. Like that one hand, you've surrendered and you've purposefully played not the best strategy, but maybe the second best strategy, right? If we take the best strategy as exploiting your opponent, then the second best strategy as being completely agnostic and just RNG, you've purposely surrendered to taking the best strategy, and you've taken the second best strategy, which has merit, because sometimes you don't know what the best strategy is, right? So just accept whenever you do those things, like, okay, if you find yourself RNGing a lot, what's probably happening is you're just like not being accountable. Okay, if you're RNGing a lot, you're surrendering a lot of the time to basically not playing the best strategy. And what you should do is study those lines and figure out how could you improve upon it. So in this case, as a temporary fix, it's an okay protocol to have. Okay, whenever I don't know what to do, I RNG. Okay, fair enough. But figure out what to do for next time, right? Don't leave it at that. And then it's a little bit of a joke I wrote here. You also should RNG when your opponent knows the exact composition of your range down to every blocker and can adjust and exploit every single line you take on every future node and round. If that is true, then yes, you should definitely RNG, and you will lose anyway, because that player will crush you regardless of what you do. But yeah, I mean, this is just a little bit of a joke, illustrating that this player does not exist. Okay, now let's talk about the pitfalls of not mixing. What happens if you do not mix? We've talked about why RNGing maybe is overhyped by some players, or why maybe some of the purposes that it fulfills in the solver, maybe in practice they're not really fulfilling anything, right? So let's talk about the opposite now. Why not mixing can be also a problem. It can be used as an excuse to ignore leaks that are exploitable by humans, right? There's two extremes. There's the guy that is just like, oh, this 17%, 10%, but this, but that. And then there's the guy on the other extreme that's like, me have flush draw, me bet, right? And that guy is basically using this sort of argument as an excuse, like, I mean, solvers, who cares about us? So, like, I mean, real life is not like a solver, so I'm just going to bet with a flush draw. Wait, no. I mean, some things are exploitable by humans. What I'm saying is that you shouldn't. Here's what I'm saying, basically. This is my analogy. This is like if a government agency spent $10 billion a year on preventing a zombie apocalypse, preparing for a zombie apocalypse, right? Like, it's not going to happen. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't prepare for anything? No, right? You shouldn't take it to the other extreme. Oh, because there's not going to be a zombie apocalypse, we're not going to build, I don't know, bunkers or have, supplies and stuff, because there's never going to be a zombie apocalypse. Yes, but there's going to be pandemics and tsunamis and earthquakes and all kinds of stuff, right? So don't use this as an excuse to go to the extreme and just throw everything out the window and just playing totally imbalanced ways for no reason. Another thing about not mixing is that you need to actually be better at range visualization. As you get better as a player, you start being able to visualize your range and your opponent's range more clearly, right? And this allows you to not have to mix as much, because you can allocate hands one by one. Okay, I'm going to bet when I have this hand and not when I have this other hand, right? This overview of your range allows you to pick hands rather than just randomly play. And also, one good thing about RNGing is that it is a fallacy to say that not RNGing is inherently more logical or is inherently less random. We all make a lot of random decisions and a lot of emotional-based decisions. Maybe we're on tilt, maybe we're just in a good mood or in a worse mood because our girlfriend broke up with us, or just whatever. There's a lot of things going on in your brain that you can't control that will, whether you like it or not, affect how you play. And so you could say that not RNGing in a way is still subject to randomness. That's even worse because it's biased, right? And this is a very, very common leak, right? If someone is just inherently passive and overfoldy, whenever they try to use logic and reason, their logic and reason ends up being passive and overfoldy because they're biased. Their emotions are still affecting their logical trains of thought. Okay, so this is why you need to also train your self-awareness, emotional intelligence, emotional awareness. This is why I'm saying, like, RNG is really, really good as a band-aid solution. And by the way, a lot of good players RNG a lot more than me. So this is not, by the way, saying like you have to do things like I'm saying you have. I just want you to understand what the point of it is, and then you can decide the extent. I mix to some extent. Some players mix to a higher extent. Some players not at all. Right? So it's all relative. You have to find what you think suits you best, but based on real reasons. To summarize, the solver mixes for some human applicable reasons and for some solver only reasons. Some reasons are very valid, and then some reasons are just never gonna actually apply to real life. You should focus on hand characteristics and hand worth. Hand worth is extremely important to plan out the hand from earlier streets and to play the correct lines on the river. RNG is most useful in narrow spots and least useful in wide spots. And use your brain. Just whatever you do, use your brain. Whether you use it more, you use it less, you don't use it at all. Keep your brain engaged and try to make meaningful decisions. If you got any questions, make sure to comment or ask on Discord. And thank you guys for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.